that I will chair the session. So I suggest that each of the presenters will have 8 minutes for the presentation, and then after all the presentations will be finished, we'll have the number of rounds of Q&A sessions. Okay, and the first will be in the program Peter Rutland from the Wesleyan University. Why the West is losing the global information war over Ukraine and how it can be fixed.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for coming to the final session of a long and interesting day. And this paper is hot from the press. I finished it about a week ago or less, and it's a 4,000-word paper, and I'm happy to share it with you. Just email me, prutland@wesleyan.edu, and I'll send it to you. And I have an 8-minute summary PowerPoint version, which I will launch now. So the from current slide. Okay. Oh, I can't see the cursor. The cursor has disappeared. So the need to write this paper came in about March when I was on a Zoom panel at the Jawaharlal University in New Delhi from Connecticut. And I was struck by the pro-Russian and anti-American tone of the questions in particular. The other panelists were kind of more or less objective, but the audience, now that's a very left-wing radical institution. So, but even calibrating for that, like left-wing anti-colonial intellectuals should be against Russia. So that was my inspiration for doing the research for this paper. So, okay, so the basic question is the West versus the rest, and these numbers came up several times already today, so I won't dwell on the voting in the March 2nd condemnation of the invasion with 35 abstentions, 5 no's, and a few other no-shows. And the point was made already today that 40 countries is a minority out of 193, but the population of those 40 is 60% of the global population, because it includes China and India. It also was South Africa, it was also an abstainer. Brazil was the only BRICS country to vote for the condemnation of Russia. And then we had that Human Rights Council excluding Russia vote, which saw the abstainers increase in number slightly. And that's a map of the votes, and it is a kind of north-south divide. That's even clearer if you just look at the 40 countries that joined sanctions on Russia. You need to have a microscope to find the Bahamas and Singapore. They were the only 2 global south, loosely understood, who joined the sanctions, not counting, of course, our Antipodean allies down there and barely on the map. So gathering data that other people collected, these surveys of public opinion in various slices of the global south, that Alliance for Democracy survey found, the results are mixed. The support for Russia is not particularly strong or deep. And that survey showed that net positive, that is subtracting the negatives from the positives, Russia only had a net positive in 11 countries, but including China and India. For comparison, the US, can't remember now exactly how many, had like 40 countries with a net positive, and China also had about 20 positives. The Open Society Foundation's survey of 22 countries found that 44% of respondents in the non-OECD members agreed with the statement that Russia is justified in wanting to have greater influence over its neighbor Ukraine than the West has, as opposed to 30% in the OECD countries. Finally, just a survey of the Arab world, the overwhelming impression from that survey was just one of indifference, that they've got so many other problems that, like Ukraine's problems, just don't feature on their radar at all. Of those who did have an opinion, it was pretty evenly matched between those supporting Ukraine and those supporting Russia. So the evidence from the surveys does to some extent mirror the evidence from the UN votes, in that there is a kind of neutrality, it's not our problem kind of opinion out there. But there is room, I think, for policy by Western countries to move the dial a little bit. It's not all bad, as it were. There's ambivalence about Russia, which I think Ukraine and its allies could make more use of. Why is this rift between condemnation of Russia in the West and kind of indifference or ambivalence in the South? Here are three possible explanations out there. The pragmatic one, it's all about arms, past arms sales, worries about future deliveries of spare parts, etc. Cheap energy and cheap food, the $20 to $30 discount on crude oil that Russia is offering buyers in the current market, that led to a significant increase in crude oil purchases by India especially, but also China, and even Saudi Arabia is buying Russian crude to power its electricity power stations, so it can sell more of its light oil on global markets. So much for our Saudi allies. Second argument is it's a after effect of Soviet soft power, of attitudes towards the North formed in the Soviet era, where the Soviets were seen as allies against Western imperialism and South African apartheid. I think that argument's particularly pertinent in the African continent, but also in places like Vietnam. And then thirdly, we have post-1991 developments where it's mainly not so much pro-Russia as anti-American, anti-Western reaction against the invasion of Iraq, the bombing of Libya, protracted war in Afghanistan. So it's some combination of those three factors, I think, is driving the global South's position. And then because this is a visual presentation, I can't resist putting in some visual slides. So here we have a kind of secret weapon in Ukraine's information war, is the astonishing transformation of Vladimir Zelensky from a comedian to some kind of combination Winston Churchill, Che Guevara figure in his camouflage t-shirts. And that's the storefront of a house in Bristol, England on the left there, with this Superman imagery is also very widespread in the Ukrainian social media. But an interesting counterpoint to that was this article in an Indian newspaper written by a retired security official from the research analysis wing, who is blasting Ukraine for bringing the war on itself. And interestingly, he combines the Superman imagery of Zelensky with the suicide belt of an Islamic terrorist. So he's trying to kind of twist Indian public opinion against Zelensky in that regard. Moving along quickly, the Western narrative, in the way that we frame the war in our own debates, focuses on democracy versus autocracy, NATO enlargement being a good thing, Ukraine's right, and the David Goliath narrative, kind of relishing Ukraine's unexpected military triumphs. And for some people, the argument about the need to contain Russia or even break up Russia, those are the dominant narratives among us. And that's mainly oriented towards domestic political audiences in the West and forging unity among European allies. But none of those arguments go down well in the global South. So what we need to, and moreover, they actually amplify the Kremlin's narrative, which is to stress the role of NATO and the West's desire to destroy Russia. So our narrative is actually kind of reinforcing the Kremlin narrative framing. Better for us to focus simply on the core facts which we can all agree on and which our global South colleagues can agree on this was an unprovoked aggressive war crimes are happening, it violates Ukrainian sovereignty. That's all really we need to say. And that's my time out. So I want to talk about Europe.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now we have the second presentation of Nizhnikau from Finnish Institute of International Affairs, which is the presentation, which is a memo which is co-authored by Arkady Moshes. Russia's war in Belarus Ravaged sovereignty.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Paulina. And yes, this is a co-authored paper, and it's already published. So I will probably try to go to certain key points, and then probably the rest can be moved to discussion. Yeah, sure. I'll probably try to actually, yes, this way. So actually, our main point is quite simple in this paper. What we say is that the main implication of the war is that it actually only further accelerates structural weakening of the Lukashenko regime. However, despite this, we actually say that there is no direct threat to the regime. And the main cause of it is that there is no actual agency which can exploit this opportunity. So what we see is that Russia is rather happy with the ongoing situation. The Belarusian opposition is in crisis, and the West and the EU in particular is not ready to actually engage at this moment, and maybe even later on in a geopolitical battle over Belarus with Russia. So having said that, we can actually stop, but I'll still say a few words. So let me elaborate on the implications. So we see several key effects. The first one is that the Lukashenko's participation in the war removed ambiguities in the Western approach to Belarus, which actually leads to Minsk in international isolation, de facto in the UN. So what we see is that if before there was still, after 2020, some discussions and debates in the West that maybe we should approach on what conditions, how we can actually help to resolve the political crisis, which is actually still ongoing. Now we see that Lukashenko is no longer anyhow trusted, and no longer is a party that the West is ready to engage with. This actually also, and we see this in the changes in the Western approach. What we see is that the sanction regime, which has been imposed, is really hurting, and its effect will be only accumulating. And the fact that Belarus lost or half of its export is under sanctions, and the most lucrative is really a big deal. And we actually can discuss also how it affects China and so on and so forth, because there is no transit. Nevertheless, one of the direct consequences of that is that it actually directly affects the domestic situation. One major effect is impact on elites. So we can discuss what exactly, we always know that the fact that elites were united and consolidated around the regime was one of the reasons why the regime survived, besides Moscow support, but survived in 2020. Now we see that with the Western sanctions, the elites more and more become disoriented, and we do see that there are more and more clashes within the elites, which is unique for Belarusian case. We see that the different groups start fighting with each other because the rents available for them are narrowing down. We see that Siloviki are not united as a group as well. We only have circumstantial data, such as different leaks and different data which is provided. But nevertheless, we see that the elites show their more and more dissatisfaction. And one of the reasons is that Lukashenko didn't deliver on the promise of power sharing after 2020. So this is a major, major impact. And obviously, we can speculate that they become more of an agency, something that has been never a case in Belarus. And I'll get back to this when I will talk about Russia a little bit. We also see definitely societal impact. We do see that the, as I said, political crisis is still remains unresolved. And the key cause of it is, if I may remind, the clash between the society and the regime, and only repressions help keep it under lead. However, we also see that the fact that Lukashenko is directly involved in the war does damage both stability and security narratives, which has been used for basically somehow maintain the small pro-Lukashenko societal groups keep supporting the regime, the stability narrative, but also somehow at the same time damages the anti-war sentiments in the society. We know that basically 90–95% of the country doesn't really want any participation in the war. So this totally wipes out already weak domestic or societal link. And again, the fact that the sanctions will really hit in a while only further undermines the so-called remainers of what has been long discussed as the backbone of the regime, the social contract. So what we actually see, even that, and the Russia factor is also, we see that Russia actually, even if it's happy with the status quo, it really, we see a growing disbalance in Moscow-Minsk relations. So we've been wondering why after 2020, Moscow didn't use the opportunity to really use the weakness of Lukashenko. We see the reason now with the Belarus role in the war, but nevertheless, we see that the balance is gone. And Moscow really becomes a gatekeeper, economic and political. And one of the reasons is that the Lukashenko lost monopoly on contacts with Belarusian elites and also actually society. We see that Belarusian elite groups more and more get directly connected with Russian groups. So this is something which changes the so-called patron-client relationships. So it's no longer Lukashenko, and actually sanctions will play a major role of it, because we see that Lukashenko will not be the one who will distribute the rents, which are narrowing, but actually Moscow directly through different programs like Importozamещение will actually deliver different carrots to elites. Having said that, we, as I said, have a problem that there is no one who can change the status quo. The opposition is more oriented towards power struggles within it. It has no ideas what actually it wants to achieve and how. Well, maybe it knows what it wants to achieve, but doesn't know how. And the West, in return, although, as I said, there is no more ambivalence in this approach, it's hardened and it will stay like this during Lukashenko's rule. It doesn't really have a clear strategy what actually it actually wants to achieve, because saying that we want democratic Belarus without any action plan doesn't bring us anywhere. And if the EU wants to achieve change in Belarus through the opposition, I can just say, good luck. And having said that, probably a few words on the implications. So what we see is that the uncertainty around Minsk will only grow. The regime is unstable, and keep relying on repressions doesn't lead anywhere. So we just wait until the next crisis. One key point which I want to mention before I go is that Russia more and more becomes a factor of instability, not stability in the country. And that actually, I would even say, doesn't depend on how the war goes, because the more negative for Russia the situation becomes, there will be probably more voices to actually also use Belarus for different reasons, and vice versa. However, at the current stage, we should not discuss occupation or let's say, incorporation of Belarus as an option. I think Putin is just happy that its armed forces are on Belarus soil and they will remain there as long as Lukashenko, who is totally dependent on Putin, will be in power. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Now we have the presentation of Mark Kramer from Harvard University. Russia, the Balkans, and security in Europe.
Okay, I need to not sure where it's. I'm going to be offering a PowerPoint presentation, but because when I prepared it, I thought I would have quite a bit more time. I'm going to be skipping a lot of the slides, but I do want to touch on. Thank you. So the this has a somewhat different title, but it's basically the same thing. I'm going to be talking about Russian policy in the Balkans, and to a large extent how it's been affected by the invasion of Ukraine. Although I do seek to put it in a larger perspective as well. So the Balkans have been. The Balkans have been an important part of Russian foreign policy going back to the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it was in part because Yugoslavia also dissolved pretty much at the same time that the Soviet Union did. And Russian officials in the 1990s paid a great deal of attention to it, but as it got to the late 1990s on the opposite side. That continues, that disjuncture continues to affect policy to this day. In the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, the region has become even more important for Russian foreign policy. So this is the region I'm talking about, roughly southeastern Europe. There is no formal definition of the Balkans. There are numerous competing definitions, but it's basically the Balkan Peninsula plus some parts extending into Turkey. I would include a considerable part of Turkey in the Balkans, Greece as well. But again, it's basically southeastern Europe. I don't like using southeastern Europe because it limits it to Europe and would exclude almost all of Turkey. But in any case, so although most Balkan countries have complied with multilateral sanctions against Russia in the wake of the invasion, two key countries, Serbia and Turkey, have refused to support the sanctions and have been helping Russia to circumvent them. Other Balkan countries, though, including ones that you might expect to be sympathetic to Russia, like Bulgaria, have taken a strong stance against Russia during the war. It's not to say everyone in Bulgaria has. I'll show you in a few minutes some of those who haven't. But my wife is originally from Bulgaria. We own apartments in Bulgaria, and so there frequently. In fact, I just came from there, and so you do see a lot of pro-Ukrainian demonstrations, but you also do see competing pro-Russian demonstrations. Even as Russia has stepped up its invasion of Ukraine, Russian officials have been seeking to foment instability and conflict in the Balkans in order to counter Western influence. So I'm going to touch very briefly on each of these things. Let me turn first to Serbia, just to say a word about that. Serbia is an interesting case, and this goes back to Peter Rutland's presentation as well. Serbia is a case in which the government has voted with the resolution to condemn in the UN General Assembly to condemn Russia's invasion, but has also continued to have a very close and friendly relationship with Russia. And again, you can date that back to the 1990s. There was, after the war of Kosovo in 1999, there was some hope in NATO countries that, and particularly after Milosevic was overthrown in October of 2000, some hope that the new leaders in Serbia would somehow reconcile themselves to the loss of Kosovo and would gradually seek a rapprochement with the West. It hasn't happened. It's almost a quarter of a century later. It hasn't happened. In fact, there is almost no indication of any real progress. There have been talks and so forth between Serbia and Kosovo, but that notion that there would be a rapprochement just naturally emerging, it simply hasn't happened. So as a result, Russia, which strongly opposed the war when NATO countries went to war with Serbia in 1999, has had a very close and friendly relationship with Russia to this day. Let me give you some examples of that to pick up on what Peter mentioned. Now, the prism through which Ukraine is viewed in Serbia is the prism of Kosovo. So there's no question that they oppose Russia's, what they call openly, Russia's aggression against Ukraine and its infringement on Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's not a whitewash in that sense, but there is a strong condemnation of what they see as NATO's hypocrisy in confronting the crisis. So let me also give you that the Serbian public remains, partly because of this dual standard that the Serbian government has used, the Serbian public remains distinctly favorable toward Russia, including about the war. So there's a June 2022 Demascop poll revealed that Putin is extremely popular among Serbs. He is the most popular foreign leader in Serbia. In addition, some 54% of Serbs believe that NATO is entirely to blame for Russia's war with Ukraine, that it's not Russia, it's NATO that is to blame. And an additional 30% believe that NATO is mostly or partly to blame. In other words, close to 85% of Serbs blame NATO either entirely or predominantly for the war. Only 7% attribute the war to Russia. So what Peter was talking about, if you want to see a country in which leaders condemn the war, but nonetheless the battle for public opinion has been lost, Serbia is a very good example of that. So again, there is no question that Russian propaganda stations, RT and Sputnik, which are still allowed to operate in Serbia, unlike in other EU countries where they've been banned. They fan those sentiments, but there is no question that pro-Putin and pro-Russian sentiments are extremely strong. In large part, again, going back to the question of Kosovo, even though many people who weren't even alive or were very young during the war with Kosovo, nonetheless, it shapes their views. Let me, again, because time is very limited, let me go to, this is an example of where Putin, the Russian government in general, has sought to inflame tensions within the Western Balkans. The Western Balkans, in particular, a fertile ground for Russia to interfere. This will show that in the Republika Srpska, the autonomous Serb region of Bosnia and Herzegovina, is that the leader of that, because again, without going into great detail, but Bosnia and Herzegovina is split into 3 entities. So there's the leadership is split among them, and the Milorad Dodik, the head of the Republika Srpska, the faction within the leadership, sent his observers to the so-called referendum that was held in Kherson this week, and this is a photo of or this is a social media carriage of what they did, which was basically to confer imprimatur on that referendum. That's very different from the Serb government's position, because the Serb government flatly opposed the referendum, but the Republika Srpska, which is separate in Bosnia and Herzegovina, has taken an ardent stance in support of Russia's war. Let me also go to just say that in northern Kosovo as well, there have been similar Russian efforts to interfere. The Western Balkans has been subject to a great deal of Russian mischief making. This person, Damjan Knežević, who was the head of the far right People's Patrol, Narodna Patrola in Serbia, has been funded and supported and trained by the Russian government. Let me go also just to say that Russian government also has taken full advantage of the homophobia throughout the Balkans, but particularly in the Western Balkans. And this was evident recently in Serbia, earlier this month in Serbia. This was one of the anti-gay pride parade demonstrations in Belgrade. You see large Russian flag, Russian tricolor flags alongside. Actually, there are no Serbian flags. There's the so the Russian flags were prominently on demonstrations. Russian Orthodox clerics marched in the anti-gay pride parades in Belgrade. This is another, you see the Russian flag over here. This was inspired by Russian Orthodox clerics in conjunction with Serbian Orthodox. So the homophobia, though, is something that Russian officials have deliberately picked up on and have sought to use to their advantage. And in fact, the gay pride demonstration was canceled in Belgrade a couple of weeks ago. So let me end up just by saying that if the EU were to take more seriously the damage caused by its failure to move much more rapidly in integrating the Western Balkans, it could greatly reduce the opportunities for Russia's malicious troublemaking. But it hasn't done that. Even now, in July of this year, finally accession negotiations were opened with Albania and Northern Macedonia, but still there's no firm timeline. They've been on hold for many years. And the same is true with the other Western Balkan countries. The Western Balkans is really the only part of Europe, except for a few neutral countries that are not under the auspices of NATO and the EU, but there are very significant exceptions. So I'll end there, and just to say that there is a great deal more covered in the paper, including Bulgaria. Actually, let me, if I could just for a second, Polina, I took it this photo. There are plenty of pro-Ukraine demonstrations you can see in Sofia. The Bulgarian government, especially before it fell, there's an election coming up the day after tomorrow in Bulgaria, but the government that fell back in mid-2022 was very strongly against Russia's war. The current caretaker government has been more equivocal, but this was one of the pro-Putin demonstrators, a much smaller counter demonstration, but Putin president peacemaker, and so you can definitely see those as well. But fortunately, in Sofia, where again in the shadow of the giant statue of Tsar Alexander II that has stood in central Sofia for many, many decades, that you do see strongly anti-Putin demonstrations as well. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have a presentation of Pavel from the Peace Research Institute of Diminished Power Projection, Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you, Polina. Please not my fault. I have no slides, so it doesn't really matter. Let me start by saying how happy I am to be again a part of this endeavor. after such a long break. It certainly feels like the best PONARS conference ever. And as a proof of that, we certainly have much more people in the audience than around this very populated table. As a good PONARSian, I certainly produced a memo on Russian intrigues in the Middle East. I'm not entirely happy with this memo. Too many intrigues to untangle in too few words. It probably doesn't quite work. Ambassador will say more about that. And it will certainly not work in the short presentation. I wouldn't take a risk of angering Polina like Mark. So I will focus on just one part of this theme on Russia-Turkey partnership, which is probably the most dynamic, the most interesting part. But hesitate not to hit me with questions about Israel, about Iran, about Saudi Arabia. I will try to answer. On Russia-Turkey, let me start right from the bottom line, that this strategic partnership, which Turkey very cleverly cultivates in this very difficult period, works very well. It is very successful, particularly as far as Turkey is concerned. It's not like many other countries in the global south, about which we have heard sitting on the fence, kind of waiting, doing a little bit of this, doing a little of that, like China, for instance. No, it is very actively maneuvering in these troubled waters. It's doing all sort of transactional maneuvering and is very successful. It is certainly works very well for Turkey itself, which not only boosts its international profile, and particularly the profile of its great leader, but also have some very material benefits from that. And in the very hard economic situation Erdogan delivered Turkey into, every ruble matters. It works for Russia, again, not only in material economic terms, but also because for Russia it's very important, one of the very few remaining channels of communication, and it also keeps Russia hoping that NATO unity may be not that strong. It works for Ukraine, which is kind of again able to keep communications with Turkey open. Erdogan visited Ukraine. It also receives from Turkey very effective combat drones, while Russia has to do with much less effective Iranian ones. It works for the West, for NATO, which NATO is able to ensure Turkey signs to the new strategic concept, that Turkey consents to NATO enlargement, not without some grumbles, but generally yes. And it also allows NATO some flexibility in dealing with Russia, not being entirely rigid, but keeping communication open. So very successful. And so when you hear the arguments that Turkey will have to choose which side of the barricade it is, don't believe it. Turkey is sitting pretty on two chairs and will probably continue to do that in the near term. That's my bottom line. And I will now give you three things which are happening and three things which are not happening. And I will end up not with the same bottom line, but with a bit of a speculation. So things which are happening, some of them are pretty obvious. Expansion of economic ties between Russia and Turkey is happening. And not only because Russian gas to Turkey, which flows perfectly smooth through two pipelines, is more expensive. So not always the dollar amount of trade indicates how it is physically going. No, it is Turkey export to Russia is increasing quite a lot. It really takes opportunities of the sanctions, which it's not a part of. Single one of NATO countries, which is not a part of sanctions regime, and is therefore not listed in Russia as a hostile state. What sort of things are exported from Turkey to Russia? It's not always clear whether it's only kind of goods which are exempt from sanctions, but the expansion of this trade is very significant. To the benefit of Turkey and to the benefit of Russia, which tries to use every opportunity to circumvent sanctions. One thing which is happening. Another thing which is happening is very high level, very intense, high intensity, high level dialogue between Putin and Erdogan. It is going on for many, many years. And of all Putin's communications on that level, it is the most intense one. Meetings and telephone conversations, there is not a single leader in the world with whom Putin had more contacts than with Erdogan. And you start counting how many conversations Putin had with Xi Jinping, well, one hand will be enough. With Erdogan, two hands are never enough. They meet anywhere, and the conversations are very material and pragmatic and productive. It's not like Putin is talking with Macron, which brings nothing but frustration. And Macron, in fact, is very irritated that Erdogan is much more successful in his communication with Putin. They discuss things and they achieve results to the mutual satisfaction. There is no love lost between the two. They know pretty much each other's strengths and weaknesses, but they are kind of also very able to score good points. The third thing which is happening is a Green Deal, which Erdogan was very proud to negotiate with Putin. Putin then expressed all sorts of reservations about this Green Deal recently in Vladivostok and then again in Moscow, saying it's not quite fair. Ships are not going where we have agreed, as if they have agreed about something of the sort. It wasn't the case. It's not the poorest countries which receive Ukrainian grain, all sorts of complaints, as if he wants to renegotiate. Erdogan very politely and correctly said, we will not reopen the deal, it will continue, and it does. The grain continues to flow, despite all the tensions in the Black Sea. It continues to work, and I think it will probably stay on track. Three things which are not happening. One of them, surprisingly, is Turkish new military operation in Syria, which Erdogan announced with great fanfare, as he always does a few months ago. Everything was there, and he very well may count on successful offensive in Syria because Russia's presence in Syria is weakening. Russia has to withdraw many forces from Syria, not only Wagner's and not only surface-to-air missiles, but air force as well. Russia is not going to resist. But nevertheless, jointly, Russia, Iran, and even the United States have managed to dissuade Turkey from that. Probably Erdogan is a little bit frustrated with that, and that's why taking the points with Greece in the agency. But nevertheless, as far as Russia-Turkish partnership is concerned, Syria was always a difficult part of this interaction. And nothing is happening in Syria, surprisingly. You would probably suspect that the Ukrainian war would resonate there. It doesn't. What else is not happening? I think it's important to point out that Turkish trade with Russia is not really sanctioned. And nobody is really threatening Turkey with punishment for that. There were expressed reservations about financial side of this interaction, particularly about Russian cards, Mir card, which Turkish bank accepted, and Turkish banks said, all right, we are not doing that. We will find some other ways to accommodate the new inflow of Russian emigres, a new inflow of Russian investment, even in Turkish real estate and so on and so on. But that's kind of one area where there were, at least there were some tensions. In all other areas, what is Turkey exporting to Russia? What sort of impact on sanctions regime it does? Nobody seems to care very much about that in the United States, which is quite remarkable. And the last thing which isn't happening is NATO naval activity in the Black Sea. There is a well-established pattern of NATO combat ships entering the Black Sea for exercises. And in this situation, it would be probably very useful for Romania and Bulgaria in particular, where some NATO units were deployed on land, but nothing is happening on sea. Turkey said, we are closing the straits for the Russian Navy, but we really don't want to see any NATO vessels in the Black Sea. That's not happening. While it could have very significant impact on the course of war. In the area, it still might. We will see how it will develop in the weeks to come, because Russia is definitely changing the pattern of the whole war from losing slowly to losing very fast. Now, yes, sure. My last word, my speculation. Turkey is looking into very important elections, and Russian stake there, Putin's stake there is very high. He wants really Erdogan to remain in power. So I expect that Turkey could have experienced all sort of Russian hybrid operations in support of Erdogan to influence these elections. There is certain experience in the Russian special services on that. There are new channels now opened because of the very significant migration from Russia into Turkey. So I would watch for a hybrid attack on Turkish election. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now, Hilary Appel from Claremont McKenna College, authored with the Boyang limits of the Russia-China partnership after the Ukraine invasion.
Where you going? Just this to front and forth.
Yes, I believe so.
We can get rid of some of this stuff.
Sorry.
Doesn't want to go.
No. Is that okay with?
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. We'll make it through. Thank you so much. All right, good afternoon. The last talk of the last panel. So thank you for making it to this point. Let me thank also my co-author, Boyang. I'm so happy is here to be part of this conference today and for his work with me on this paper this summer. I also want to thank PONARS and Marlene for your leadership in PONARS, and Henry, of course, and David as well. So I'm just very grateful for all that you do to allow this organization to continue to thrive for so long now. So this paper on the limits of the China-Russia partnership after the Ukraine invasion is something I've been thinking about quite a bit. If I'm not mistaken, my last PONARS memo was about the rapprochement between China and Russia in different regards, certainly between the leaders of Xi and Putin, but also the new economic relationship that had been developing, the extensive military cooperation that had been growing. So it's within that context that I wanted to examine the relationship since the war has begun. And of course, there's been a lot of attention to the relationship because even before the war, even before the invasion, there was that very famous phrase of this partnership, this friendship without limits, which made a lot of people nervous because with the buildup already of troops on Ukraine's borders, there was a sense that perhaps this was an indication that China was greenlighting a war in Ukraine, certainly after the war began, after this shockingly full-scale invasion occurred by land, by air, by sea. But did China know? Did China support this? Is this part of this friendship without limits? Is that what this was referencing? Now, this interpretation, of course, created some nervousness because, in fact, there was a tendency to try to walk back those statements. Come on. Let's see if this will do it. Sure. To walk back those statements, you know, there were some important expressions of sort of muted response. There was the case of the op-ed in the Washington Post where Beijing's ambassador to Washington said, you know, assertions that China knew about, acquiesced, or tacitly supported this war are purely disinformation. Also, the vice foreign minister categorically rejected the idea is absurd that China endorsed this war in advance. There were a lot of statements trying to pull back, and yet at the same time, I'm sure as many in this room know, we have seen continual rhetorical support by China of Russia's invasion and of this war. And in fact, it does leave us with some question as to how, how does it see the war? So, President Xi had stated at the BRICS conference in June that some countries, without identifying the West, but some countries have enlarged military alliances producing military conflicts. The foreign minister in May referencing NATO's eastward enlargement as the root cause of the crisis. As you know, spokespeople in China are not referring to this as a war in most cases, but a crisis. It recognizes Russia's legitimate security concerns. So this rhetorical support does raise the question of where does China stand in this war? Is the rhetorical support backed up by material support? So the work that Boyang and I had done was to try to examine the material support or the material relationship between China and Russia in order to get a better sense of it. And so the reality is that in many ways, we can see this as yet another example of hedging. Because in terms of material support, and these are the areas I'll talk about in a minute, I'll show you some data, we don't see a clear backing of Russia and Russia's foreign policy interests by China if you look at some of these specific variables. So I think that's pretty important to pay attention to both the economic areas of cooperation as well as military. And by the way, this is something that we know we don't have a lot of data coming from the Russian side. It's not publishing data the way it has in the past, but fortunately China is publishing data on trade and on these relationships. So that has been a useful source of data, published data as well. So you'll see that those sources here. So if we just look at different areas, oh goodness. All right, well, this is China's semiconductor exports to Russia. You can see that there was a decision to, or at least a reality of a decrease after the invasion. It went down, but it has been steadily rising in terms of semiconductor exports to Russia. If we look at, this is China's fossil fuel imports from Russia. This is an example of clear continued access and acquisition of hydrocarbons, of fossil fuels. China continues to buy Russian oil and gas, as you all know, but this has been actually quite unsurprising and even normal, given that even the Europeans themselves have been unable to rid themselves of Russian oil and gas, and it does not violate the sanctions. It doesn't make China run afoul of the sanction regime. So even though the United States has banned Russian oil, the Europeans have not. It depends how oil is being delivered. Gas, as we know about, they're trying to have voluntary reductions of gas use, of which Slovakia said they will not participate and has its own gas deal. So I wouldn't say that the continued import of oil and gas in any way signifies a violation of the West's sanction regime. On the contrary, the West has continued to absorb, the West has continued in Europe anyway to continue to import fossil fuels. At the same time, we also know that these numbers may even understate it because the Russians and the Indians have been able to buy oil at these significantly discounted price, even as high as $35 a barrel, when in the past, the spread, the discount has been more in the line of $5 a barrel. So this has been very important reason to see high levels of continuation. To show you some other areas, if we look at weapons, did that come up yet? Yes. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. If you want to look at the slide, it makes 2 points. So we can see that there's actually been, there has not been an increase in the weapons that have been exported from China to Russia. We know now they're looking to North Korea, as was mentioned earlier in the panel. But what is also interesting that this shows is that the United States actually imports quite a bit more Chinese ammunition and weapons. So again, I'm not trying to make the point that China is siding with the United States in this conflict, in this war, but at the same time, certainly the data don't support that it has been in any way arming Russia, and that's very significant. All right. Now, if we go across different areas, we look at aluminum, we look at different things in this paper, and we do have a memo as well. But at the same time, I want to make clear that the balance is somewhat precarious. I don't say that the balance is fixed. It's not set in stone. There are certain things that I imagine could alter China's decision to hedge. So China has been hedging. It hasn't been able to do so as actively as Turkey. I would absolutely agree with that. That's taken on this mediating role. There are other US allies that are afraid to come very strongly down in favor on the US position, like Israel. You didn't mention that, but I imagine you've been looking at this as well because of similar interests on its immigration program of Jews living in Russia, but also motivated by its desire to strike Hezbollah targets in Syria. I mean, unofficially anyway. So there are other US allies that have been unable to clearly take a pro-West stand in the war or an anti-Russian stand in the war. So China in some ways shares some of those similarities. What is important is that rhetorical support, which has more or less remained pretty stable. People are watching it. We're all watching it very closely after the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was only referenced that China has some problems by Putin himself, as you know, not by President Xi, even if Modi was more vocal in stating this was not the time of war. What could alter China's position? I imagine a lot of things. In the last panels, we've talked about the use of a nuclear weapon. I don't even know what to do with that. I suppose if there's a use of a tactical nuclear weapon, this could alter the calculation. But I don't really know what to make of that because we don't have any evidence to say anything about that, even though I've been looking for it. What we can say that there might be some other things. I would imagine that if Putin falters, that China would withdraw some of this support, even its rhetorical support, I should say, for Russia. As Fiona Hill had stated, and many people have stated that she does not want to back, she said a losing horse, doesn't want to back at the losing side, right? So I think if Putin seems to falter, either because the war effort continues on the battlefield to lose ground, or if domestic politics continue to destabilize, and he somehow is pushed out by some kind of coup at home, I would expect the Chinese position could be altered at that point. But it could also go the other direction. I would imagine that if the US crosses the line on certain issues surrounding Taiwan, we could see a different policy. For example, if Congress were to pass the Taiwan Policy Act as it currently is written, then China might provide more support in response to Russia, albeit perhaps not directly, perhaps through a third party like Iran or North Korea. So I wouldn't say we should count on China's position to be static. It may be altered by some of these factors that I've raised. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So much, and now we have the floor is goes to Discussant, Ambassador Rubin.
Great, thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be back at PONARS. I have been really honored to be part of PONARS since the very beginning in the 1990s with people like Celeste Wallander, Mike McFall, and Sarah Mendelson, and other people who were there at the beginning. And it's so great to have everybody back in person. So I'm really glad to be able to do this panel and to be here with all of you. And I still think PONARS is probably the best group of its kind at a time when these issues are more important to the future of the world than they ever have been, I think. So thank you for that. I'll just offer a few comments on these really excellent papers and presentations, and it's really a privilege to be with such a great panel. Several people I've known for a long time. One of the things I'd start with is obviously the general theme is how much everything's changed since our last PONARS conference. It is truly a different world. And so I think that really needs to be the focus. I think from Peter's paper, I was struck by the very strong argument he makes, which I personally agree with. I've said it's a personal position, not representing the US government or anybody else, that this needs to be about sovereignty and borders and the UN Charter and not about other things. supporting democracy in Ukraine, which is truly a democracy and truly aspires to join the family of democracies and the world that we want to see, all of which is great. That can't be the argument. The argument is if you go down this road, the whole world system blows up. And, you know, let's ask the Chinese if they want to have a referendum in Taiwan. Let's ask the Indians if they want to have a referendum in Kashmir. Let's see how that goes. That could be really interesting. Let's blow up the whole world. And if not, then let's reject what Russia is doing because it's so dangerous and so wrong and so illegal. And I think that is the only argument. So we can do better in terms of our messaging. We, the US, NATO, our allies, there's no question. The last thing I'll say on that is I think much of the global South, much of the world is skeptical because of things like Iraq, because of lingering anti-colonial sentiment, all sorts of things that, and Peter mentioned a whole bunch of them, but I think we just got to focus on those key issues. On Belarus, Ryhor and Arkady have done a great paper. I was actually the US official that opened our outreach initiative to Lukashenko in 2014. I met with him 3 times. If anybody tells you that Lukashenko had no choice but to go with Putin because the US and the EU rejected him, you can tell them that that is simply not true at all. He had a total alternative and we were hoping to really see it happen. We lifted sanctions. We brought Belarus Kali's potash exports to the United States. We negotiated for the release of political prisoners. It's a complicated question of why Belarus is where it is now, but it's certainly not because the US and the EU and NATO weren't willing to try to work with Lukashenko. Certainly not true. And to the extent that's the Russian narrative, it's not true. It's actually quite tragic to see things where they are now. But anyway, that's a great paper. Mark's comments on the Balkans are definitely spot on. I'm personally a little shocked and disappointed that the Serbian pro-Russian numbers are so high. There's no question that there's been a pro-Russian thing going on in Serbia for a very long time, but when you start seeing numbers in the 80 percentiles, it's actually really awful. But that is fact, so we've got to deal with it. But I can say, as the former US ambassador of Bulgaria, somebody who's actively following the upcoming Bulgarian elections and other things, Putin's actions have led to really seismic shifts in the Balkans. And I can just tell you from so many people, and I know Mark has his own context, Russia has lost a lot of the soft support it had in countries like Bulgaria. Not all of it. And of course, there are people in all these countries who like Putin and like his version of civilization, but not that many. And most of them, to the extent they were sort of nostalgic and soft supporters of you know, the link with Russia, they're pretty appalled by what Russia has done. And that's going to have consequences for a very long time. And if you look at the elections, we don't know the results, but we've seen the polls in a few days. Overall, the results are going to have many fewer sympathetic to Russia members of parliament than there were 5 years ago, many fewer. There is a new pro-Russia party. It will be in the parliament, but then if you take away the declines in the socialists and others, overall, the politics have shifted as we hope they would toward NATO and the EU, both of which Bulgaria is a member of. Romania is a little simpler because of the historic enmity with Russia and some of the other countries. But I think the key point here is Russia has lost so much ground because of their actions and because of Putin's actions, which leads, I think, to Pavel's paper, which is about the Middle East, but I think it can be extrapolated to the whole world. I think when a historical view is taken of Russia's role in the world, this is a turning point this past year, because I think Russia's global role has diminished so much because of its own actions. And that's not wishful thinking, and it's not because I'm angry about what Russia's done. It's just an objective view of Russia in the world. And certainly in the Middle East, that's the case. Even if you see the complicated politics of Israel as Israel faces new elections, the Russian role is much diminished, including among Russian speakers, partly because I always quote former ambassador to Russia, Bill Burns, who's now director of the CIA, and he had a great line, which maybe wasn't original, I don't know, but his line was, the Russians are never satisfied with just doing it, they always have to overdo it. And in this case, in a bad way, Russia has so overdone it in terms of the brutality and the just outrageous violation that I think they've lost a lot. It doesn't mean the world is looking at things our way necessarily. I don't think so, which leads to Hilary's paper in China. And I think the same thing applies there. I mean, I'm not a sinologist, but I've done some work on US-China relations. I think the Chinese are fundamentally conservative in the sense that the world systems worked pretty well for them over the past 30 or 40 years. And the Russians are trying to blow it up. And I really, the other thing is, having been in the Russian Far East, having spent time in Vladivostok and Khabarovsk and Magadan and Birobidzhan and other places, you know, I honestly think most Chinese officials probably think those places should be Chinese. And they were once upon a time, and they may be again, because there's only, the real figure is probably about 4 million Russians in the eastern third of Russia. Out of 135 or 140 million Russians, the eastern third, maybe 5 million, but I think that's an exaggeration. There's nobody there. And the young people are leaving. And the Chinese have an extra 100 million or 200 million people who can come and fill the gap any day that that's available. So I'm not predicting that anytime soon, but I do think that is a real factor. But also, as I think Hilary was saying, I don't think the Chinese like losers, and this doesn't look impressive, this whole mess. So we'll see. It's not my business to comment on US policy, except to say a lot of us are pleasantly surprised by how well the US, NATO, Japan, Australia, New Zealand coalitions held together with countries like Singapore and others who joined. Everybody's asking the question, how long can it last? Will it hold? A lot of that depends on Russia's actions. But I think the key point for this panel and the overall is how much things have changed. I would say that it's not unfair to say that Russia really, Putin, to the extent he runs Russia, really screwed up. And this is going to hurt Russia going forward. It already has in so many ways around the world, but all the unpredictabilities are obviously hard to predict. So with that, I'll stop, and glad to join the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we have almost half an hour for Q&A. Okay. Okay, then Mark's
This is for Hilary. I don't know, Hilary. I mean, I get the, I've followed the Chinese press and the Chinese statements and the like. There have been abundant opportunities for China to express legitimate criticism of its own position, and it hasn't. It has consistently, for China, especially Xi Jinping, the animosity toward the West seems to override everything else. They see Russia as advancing an anti-Western agenda, even though, as everyone has mentioned, and you brought up, they don't like it that China is doing it so bad, that Russia is doing it so bad. They like it that Russia is doing it, but they don't want it to be done so. Beyond that, I don't see anything that China has done that suggests that it is uneasy with Russia's policy. The Serbian government, the Turkish government have consistently expressed criticisms of Russia's movement, have denounced the infringement on sovereignty, the annexation of Crimea, and so forth. I remember when I was in China in 2014, and there were a lot of Chinese academics who were predicting that the Chinese government would oppose the annexation of Crimea. It didn't support it. Now it hasn't been quite so. It did support it. It did support it. So I really see China's position as purely one about confidence and not about the principle or the legitimacy of what Russia's.
Okay.
I have a question about the same issue of Chinese position. Hello, sorry. I also have a question about that same position of China towards Russia. So the conventional narrative, at least within Russia domestically, is that China would not allow an autocratic regime in Russia to fall. So it's against Russia, the Chinese interests for Russian autocracy to fall because there might be a chain reaction, but it's not. Essentially, China is to Putin, what Putin is to Belarus, to Lukashenko. I wonder what your comment is on that.
The gentleman over there, you have a question? Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll just wait for the mic. Hi. Sarah Oates, University of Maryland. I last studied 40 years ago. I know, right? So thank you so much for this. I told my husband this morning, I'm not going to have any trouble paying attention at this seminar today. It's not always true. But the question I had for Peter, what does success look like for Lukashenko? And what does success look like for Putin? And if anyone would like to answer that or think about that, because it's something what will Putin do next? What's he doing? Will he use nukes? What's the end game? So that's just a sort of thought question. Adam, please.
Adam from Georgia Tech. This is also a question. You talked about the structural weaknesses of Belarus right now. I'm just wondering, why would the West want to do it since Russia is increasingly phoning? You sort of mentioned different things that we could be doing, but if it is structurally weak and Russia is really the only option, is it going to be a hard pill for them to swallow? Why would we want to do anything to potentially undermine?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Katerina Shankaruk, School of Government and Public Service. I have a question to Peter Rutland and to Ambassador Eric Rubin with regard to the information warfare by Russia. So obviously there is a loss in the global south in terms of messaging, but given the budgets Russia is spending on its propaganda, isn't it also an indication that the West is basically not considering its own goal and task to counter that warfare in a symmetric way? To quote Peter Pomerantsev, who is researching propaganda by Russia, the Russian current strategy is an open warfare, whereas the West is not considering it currently the point of leading a war in the information side, like its own war, rather than just supporting Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay. I think that probably we would give the round of answers and then start with new questions, because there are already too many questions and I think that a lot of confusion. Let us start.
Before you answer the question, can you repeat the question, because I'm getting messages.
I can't repeat questions.
Because they don't have them.
When we answer.
Yeah, I think that will start off with.
All right, thank you for the questions. The first question was concerning the way I characterized the support by China for Russia, whether or not it's actually much more fulsome than I characterize it. I would say there's no question that on the rhetorical level, you can see an abundance of examples of very strong support for Russia's position, and that I don't disagree with. What I would, and all this hope that maybe now coming out of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, something else might be revealed. That just, doesn't in any way really diminish just how strongly Russia has received this rhetorical support from China. So really the point is to try to look at this in a material sense to see whether or not there was real support. And I would say I haven't seen examples or trends that suggest things are all that different this year when it comes to military exercises, military exports, and a lot of different sectors. Now, if you, again, oil and gas, there's a really significant jump. But again, I don't think that is all that telling in terms of providing material support. It certainly isn't forbidden. In this question also about principle, like whether this is a principled position or whether or not there's really just, China wouldn't want Putin to fall. Well, that's true. I think the whole point is, yes, I mean, I agree with you. I think that would be very disappointing for the Putin regime to fall, for Putin command to fall. There seems to be some personal rapport between Xi and Putin, but he's not going down with the ship either. I mean, China is not dependent on Russia in that way. It's a, 3 trillion, I mean, it depends on the exchange rate, of course, but 3 trillion versus $30 trillion market in terms of what it means for China. Of course, China's interests in the West are greater, and certainly the ambassador's point about how China has done under this regime, under the international system is clear, right? China has been very successful under the rules of the game created at Bretton Woods. So certainly if Russia is blowing it up, that's not a good thing for China. And the other point, also addressing Mark's initial idea, what is China gaining from all of this? In the end, it has lost some of its core interests. It's just referenced quickly in the paper, but before this war, the Europeans have been trying to stay out of this burgeoning Cold War between the US and China, and now this war has pushed it away from China closer to the US, and also, a real unity within Europe, which China had done some work at chipping away at. So I would say this war has diminished Chinese interest in Europe and very much related to its position on this war. So I cannot disagree that China has repeatedly expressed support. And in the memo, I think the word we use is even like it's parroting the position that this is a result of NATO enlargement. So I don't disagree with the support for the principle and legitimacy of this special operation and the natural security interests of a great power in its own neighborhood. So I think those positions are certainly well taken, but nonetheless, that 30 trillion market in Europe and North America is worth quite a bit as well, and that has been motivating a lot of economic behavior and military.
I might try to address the question of endgame. And I think what we see now is that our thinking about how this war might end, how to find a way out of this situation is increasingly not about Putin. It's not about Putin's endgame. It's about how to deal with the unfolding disaster after Putin. And I don't think it is a hypothetical proposition. I think the unfolding defeat, which might become very accelerated because of the decision to mobilize, because of the referenda, because of the domestic developments in Russia, combined with the kinetic war, which is not going at all according to the plan, we might start discussing options for Russia for its non-catastrophic defeat and doing a roadmap for the way forward with a gang of successors who would find a way to get rid of the person who made himself such a central part of the absolutely impossible problem.
Thank you, Pavel.
I mean, I like what so
So I think we're much more.
Thank you for the questions. I actually start by saying that we have a panel lineup, which is China, Turkey, Belarus. Reminds me a bit of a classic Kramer, Rubin, and Pentecost, and we still have questions in Belarus. It's great. So two questions. First, why West should do anything. In my opinion, I'll make 2 points very fast. The first one, and actually I will probably in passing say there is a moral side I think we should take into account. Like if the EU at least still wants to proclaim itself a value-based actor, which is obviously past that stage. But I would even say that can they let those people in society to be a hostage to maniacs as well, given that the West has been actually letting, I would say, society down for quite a while, especially during the latest rapprochement. This is my position. That the opportunity hasn't been used. But the main point is it's actually fits of interest. That's what I would say. It's in the Western interest because if Belarus will remain with Lukashenko without the Russian orbit, when we have a situation like that, it will always be one of the points of instability in the region. And it's migration crisis, participation in the Russian invasion would be the end point. So I would say it's in interest, and obviously also because it just can now do it. If it wants, it can invest resources, which will actually damage Moscow because Moscow doesn't have to invest more. So far, Moscow invests very little in maintaining some kind of stability in the country. And the second question, what is successful Lukashenko? Basically, stay in power tomorrow. That's it. He surrenders everything for power, for being in power himself. We see he doesn't care about the country's sovereignty and whatever. He wants is just to be where he is tomorrow. That's it.
Okay, on the last question about China, there was a speech by Foreign Minister Wang Yi in the UN Security Council on the 22nd of September, where he called for de-escalation and dialogue and said, quote, "The sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries must be respected." And the Indian Prime Minister was even more direct. So I can't imagine what the Russian ambassador was thinking, listening to that. It's a pretty clear signal to me that the Chinese are pissed off with what Russia's doing. On the question of information war in the global south, I'm not sure we need to spend any more money there. I think the BBC, CNN, Deutsche Welle are doing a pretty good job of telling people what's happening. But my argument in this paper was mainly focused on the debates in Washington, D.C. and London and Brussels, where there's all this hyping of NATO as the solution. But I think NATO is the problem. And Ukraine is not going to succeed if they just go along with the kind of NATO lobby. I think you've got to separate NATO's interests from Ukraine's interests and from US national interests. On the question of Putin's goal, I think it's Crimea, just Crimea. In a century-old perspective of Russian security, they cannot afford to lose Crimea. To get Crimea, he needs the land bridge, the North Crimea Canal, and to me, all the rest is just BS. The denazification, the banderites, NATO enlargement even, that's all ideological froth to cover the geopolitical land grab. That's on my view.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. On the question of what we're doing in terms of reaching out to the global south and to world audiences, I think I would agree with Peter that it's not really because we're not reaching people, although I would say that well, it's true the BBC and other global media can reach people all over the world. Our government and other allied governments are not really trying, and they're not spending any money compared to what we did during the Cold War, and I'm a witness to that. I can't promise that if we spend a lot of money, it would make a big difference, but if you don't try, then you definitely don't succeed. We're not making any effort at all to convince the world of our perspective, certainly not spending money. It's one thing to have the White House press secretary standing in front of the podium, but it's another thing to reach out to people in their own languages and actually try to convince them. But the second thing I would say about that is we have to confront the reality of continuing global suspicion and anger about the Iraq War, about Afghanistan. I say this as a lifelong, career-long American diplomat. It's out there, it's a fact, and so there's a reluctance to side with us and our NATO allies in Japan, and all the other partners from Afghanistan and Iraq. But at the same time, you know, I do think our arguments are very strong, and the Russian position is weak, and we've got to try to make it a little harder. And again, I would just endorse the idea that we need to focus on sovereignty, the UN Charter, and borders, and not other issues, however valid they may be.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, we have a new panel. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Jose Serra, DCA Foundation in Latin America. We're focusing on Hi, my name is Jose Serra, DCA Foundation. We focus on the effects of kleptocracy in Latin America, and we've been very concerned over the last few years of the effect of Putin's soft or hard diplomacy efforts over there. And it seems that every time you look around on the kleptocracy in our governments, some sort of a Putin ally or actually over there. So I guess I know that none of you here has presented any part of Latin America, but I would appreciate if you have any thoughts or have heard anything that you would like on how we can improve our efforts fight against that regime, and especially, so I guess for us it's an opportunity where he's distracted by the Ukraine war, maybe I would say access to resources. And the last question for Professor Rutland, you mentioned the talking point regarding the anti-colonial left in the US. Would those same talking points apply to in Latin America? We get much more the far right expression about the efforts.
I'm Peter Humphrey, intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Quick question: if the Russian National Suicide Project continues apace, is there any chance Lukashenko survives Putin, or is Lukashenko toast pretty much at the same time, and his system as well? I mean, not just him. And second of all, do you have any good estimate for how many Belarusians are assisting on the ground in Ukraine in both the military and aid capacities?
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, Dennis Murphy, Georgia Tech, formerly SciENS. My question has to do with the shifting nature of global geopolitics. Often they are not unidirectional, nor are they uniform. In any of the things that you have studied thus far, has there been any inconsistencies that might give a potential presage change in the future? For instance, over the course of the summer, there might have been reversals, such as with semiconductors. Is there anything that we might be on the lookout to see potential changes that might be moving things one way or another vis-a-vis support or opposition to Russia? Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you, Marsh McGraw Olive, SciENS and Wilson Center. I want to take you a little bit along the lines of the last question to say, all the panelists, how is the geopolitical restructuring going to have a geoeconomic impact? I'm looking at the fact that there's much more interest in the middle corridor through Central Asia by both the Chinese and the Americans, because the land route through Russia and Belarus to Europe will be impaired. I'm thinking of China's pulling back from the RI, but looking at now finally the China Kyrgyz Uzbek rail link. I'm thinking of Russia looking at the north-south corridor for reaching out recently to the Taliban. New arrangements between the Trans-Caspian pipeline. There are some movements that would seem to be revisiting Kent Calder's view of Eurasia as a supercontinent. The interest of China and Russia will still be for raw materials. Where do you see the project past this invasion, where we go geoeconomically?
Yes, the last row. I don't see who, but I see the hand.
Stanley Kober. I've been coming to these conferences for years, maybe since the 90s. The conference title is New Approaches to Russian Security. I'm not hearing new approaches. Same old, same old. If what we were doing was so right, how did we end up here? Compare the situation now to 1990. I was in Moscow. It was one. Now Americans have been told leave Russia. How did we get here if what we were doing was so brilliant?
No more questions. I think that we have pretty limited time, just for enough for answers. So yeah, probably let us start in the reverse order.
Okay. Yeah, to answer the last question, just a personal view, I think we suffer from self-importance, both as the United States and as the so-called West. And so the idea that we delivered this result in Russia doesn't strike me as correct. Obviously, mistakes were made, to use the passive tense. Lots of mistakes in our systems, programs, and our political approach. I wouldn't disagree for a second. But this one's not on us, and I was there on the ground, and it was the fact that we spent hundreds of, actually billions of dollars to try to support Russia's transition. They have a stock market because of us. They have all these energy resources they're pumping out of the ground because of us and the Western energy companies that gave them access to it. You know, we didn't screw. This is unfortunately just a tragedy, but I don't think we should take responsibility for the most part. A little bit.
Yeah, I think anybody who believes that they knew all along this was going to happen and who didn't change their minds on February 24th doesn't deserve to have a job as an academic, because the world changes and we have to change our opinions and adapt to changing reality. So I'm agreeing with Stanley that we do need to look back and see how we were interpreting the world and why we were all caught by surprise. On the question of Latin America, my impression is that the left is kind of doing okay in Latin America through the ballot box and through, you know, resource extraction, lithium mines or whatever. So the Latin American left don't need Russia or some kind of global anti-imperialist ideology to try to improve a lot of their societies. And on the far right thing, I think I'm correct that both Lula and Bolsonaro in Brazil have condemned the invasion of Ukraine. So it looks like that Brazil is kind of holding up in terms of rules-based order. And Mexico is more of a problem. On the question of geoeconomics, one thing that I haven't heard anybody talk about today is China's economic interests in Ukraine. I think they have like $70 billion of trade, a lot of leasing of arable land and so on. That's all gone up in smoke. So that's another thing on the Chinese ledger of ways that Putin is not a very useful ally, is that he's blown up something which was, I think, very important to China for its integration into European economies.
It's a very good question. I was sure it would get out of here. So, double toast.
But it's, I would say there's also high probability use earlier because it will be more harder and harder to maintain the situation under control. But I wouldn't make any predictions. I'll just wait for the next crisis. That's my point with others. Regarding numbers, well, actually, we have numbers on the military participation. There are these Belarusian units which are part of the Ukrainian armed forces, and the biggest one is actually up to 500. They have bit 1 to 8, but they are part and they're on the front line. They're also smaller units, so I would say roughly up to 700 plus the ones who are in the Ukrainian army as individuals, so maybe up to 12,000 overall. When it comes to volunteers, I would put it this way. Much of the work of the Belarusians who escaped Lukashenko's regime to Ukraine and then to Ukraine, from Ukraine to Poland or stayed in Ukraine. But anyway, much of their work has been actually reoriented towards Ukraine, because for some it's actually it's a very simple. They are disillusioned with the opposition's approach, and they think that the faster Ukraine wins, the closer will be changing values. So I would say it's thousands of Belarusians who work on that cause.
Just on the question about assessing changes, I mean, in the Balkans, it is interesting to see how the war, again, with the exception of Serbia and Turkey, where the situation is a lot more complicated, but elsewhere, how the war has cost the Russian government a great deal, probably for good. So, for example, Bulgaria, which going back to 2014, the annexation of Crimea, where Bulgaria backed out of the South Stream pipeline, but much more importantly now, this year, Bulgaria basically put an end to its oil goods from Russia, partly through necessity and partly because the Russian government cut off gas shipments. But for a country that is almost entirely dependent on Russia for energy imports, that's an extremely significant step. And it's a country that had traditionally been very friendly to Russia. So it has lost a great deal of influence. And as I say, probably it's going to be very hard. With regard to one very quick comment, when you made that comment in regard to the legislation that's before Congress on Taiwan, it really had very little, except what people want to infer about Russia's war in Ukraine. It was directed at the United States. I mean, I'd like to believe that Chinese leaders are going to express criticism of this war at some point, but it hasn't happened yet. And the banal statements about wanting to, which not only Chinese but many other governments have made about wanting to see an end to war and want solutions and all that. That's not opposition to war, because that's not how this works.
I will not go specifically into Latin America, but I was struck listening to Putin's speech yesterday, how much he's trying to use the rhetoric of leftist kind, about anti-Americanism, anti-colonialism, opium war, American Indians, whatnot. Not making a reference to kind of traditional value and gender issues, which was more right-wing agenda, but focusing very much there. Like he's trying to reconnect again with
with the kind of global left. And I think for global left, it is now a challenge to see how much he actually does damage to all this vessel, repeating this bullshit up. On the question of geopolitics and geoeconomics, yes, I think it's also a very strong line for Putin that the old world order is done, is ruined. We are entering into something entirely new, which in fact takes me rather far away from what China wants. China is a beneficiary from this world order. It doesn't really want any global catastrophe. But what I want to emphasize here is that, in fact, instead of kind of revolutionary changes, what we suddenly observe is much strengthened, really integrated West, much more united, much more confident in its values. And on the other hand, China, which is no longer rising, but stagnant. That's a trajectory which is kind of new, which we will yet to internalize, but I think it's something to think about. And on the question about new approaches and how we get here. Now, even after 30 years in Norway, I still have my Russian identity as a part of it. And it's not about how we in the West got here, it's how we in Russia got here. And it's a horrible question. And Russians are kind of completely at loss trying to answer. With all the transition, with all the hopes, with all the opportunities, with all the new reaches, suddenly we're in this deep bush. And people are running away from that. That's the only answer that they can find. And I don't think there is any responsibility for that really in the West. Most of that is a problem of post-transition in Russia itself, or a very dangerous mutation of all this post-communist regime. And at least one thing probably West is guilty of is overestimating is fundamentally a fool of the culture.
I don't think I can follow that. Yes, but I have to say, I prefer hearing this from someone who identifies as Russian than as an American to say these things. So yes, thank you.
So then we have all questions answered, or maybe all new ideas launched. So thank you very much for to everything, to the panelists first of all, for giving brilliant presentations, and for everyone who attended the session, participated, asked questions, and were inspired. Thank you very much, and see you next September. Oh, yes, next September.